So this time, let's see if I can get this to work. Okay. Last time, as you recall, we looked at strategies that companies can use to avoid or minimize or mitigate biodiversity risks. And we talked a lot about biodiversity offsetting and the concept of net positive impact. And then we looked at the opportunity side and how you can use some of these emerging payment for ecosystem service schemes to add business value, either to generate new revenue or to improve business reputation and or reduce costs, for example. What I'd like to talk about in this last lecture on implications of TEEB for business is what can we expect from companies in terms of voluntary action, and also when you reach the limits of voluntary action, what kind of other instruments do we have? What other mechanisms or incentives can we consider to stimulate more business action to conserve biodiversity and deliver ecosystem services? And I'll start, as usual, with the voluntary side. And in the TEEB for Business report, we identified a number of things that businesses could do on their own without necessarily waiting for other people to help them or give them incentives or guidance or constraints. And those can be boiled down, or I want to focus on these five in particular. And some of these we've covered already and discussed in the previous lectures. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about is targets and how companies set those and give an example. And then I'm going to come back to the last point, which is market-friendly or business-friendly environmental policy. My sense is that we've already discussed in the previous lectures numbers 2, 3, and 4. That is, measure value and report your footprint, using and improving tools for biodiversity management, and building biodiversity business. So I'll focus on 1 and 5. And I've already mentioned some examples of companies that have set what seem like ambitious or sometimes heroic or maybe aspirational targets with respect to biodiversity and other ecosystem services. And we can see this pretty much across the board in every major economy and many well-known brands where companies are making commitments on a voluntary basis that they don't have to do. And that can sometimes be a stimulus to action inside the company and increased scrutiny from outside the company. And just to give a few examples here that I selected from the company websites over the last couple of years. BC Hydro is a hydroelectric power generator based in British Columbia in Canada. And they have set themselves a rather incredible target, in my view, of no net incremental environmental impact, which is interesting because it implies that they're going to be looking at all types of ecosystem impacts or environmental impacts. And the net incremental are interesting words to use in a target as well, because they imply that they're going to be looking at pluses and minuses, credits and debits, and using this kind of net positive impact approach. Coca-Cola has a somewhat narrower target, and that is to basically leave watersheds in as good condition as they found them. And they talk about safely returning to communities and to nature an amount of water equivalent to what they use. And it's interesting here to me that they talk about the amount of water. They aren't talking about the quality of water, and maybe that's a recognition that they're not sure that they can meet that quality goal. The Danone Group, with which I've worked for several years, wants to go for carbon neutrality. They don't have to do this, so they're looking at voluntary offsets and voluntary mitigation efforts, and they're seeing this essentially as a branding action. Many of their competitors put little labels on their plastic bottles of mineral water, claiming that they are carbon neutral, and they want to be part of that. They don't want to be left behind by their competitors. And I think they are on target to achieve that initial goal of carbon neutrality for Evian. And as I may have mentioned, a big part of their strategy is investing in wetland restoration and wetland conservation, particularly planting mangroves around the world in the tropics, sometimes in countries where they have big operations, like Indonesia or Mexico, but sometimes in countries where they don't, such as India and Senegal. And it's been interesting from a biodiversity perspective because, of course, mangroves have a key role to play in protecting coastlines and as fish nurseries and as a source of food and fuel for local communities. And there are many other examples, but one I want to focus on today is Sony, and this was new to me about a year ago, and I hadn't realized that Sony had made such a commitment. But their claim is that by 2050, they will have zero environmental footprint. That's an extraordinary claim for a large multinational manufacturing, distribution, and marketing company to make. And I hadn't heard of it before. Has anyone here heard of Sony's target? No? Because it makes me wonder how feasible they think it is to achieve this target. But they certainly have said it. It's on their website. You can find it. You have to dig a bit. But they intend to have zero footprint with respect to climate change, the use of natural resources, promoting biodiversity, and controlling chemical substances. And we know because of the nature of their activities that they cannot achieve that without some kind of offsetting or compensatory action. So it implies, and they're already starting this with climate change, that they're going to have to invest quite substantially in resource conservation, climate mitigation actions outside their operations, and biodiversity offsets presumably if they're going to have any chance of achieving this target. Quite sensibly, they intend to look across the product life cycle. So they're not just looking at their own manufacturing operations, but also their procurement of raw materials, as well as the distribution of their products and the ultimate destination of those products. Again, they have time-bound milestones to achieve this target. They hope to achieve it by 2050, and then they're backcasting to try and figure out what they can deliver in the interim. I wasn't able to get from them specific quantitative targets. What are they going to achieve by 2015 or by 2020? And again, I think that is suggestive of the fact that they're a little uncertain about what they can deliver and how quickly. But they've done their homework, and I've found this of some other companies as well. They've tried to understand what the links are between their activities and biodiversity. And all of these slides are from a presentation that the company made at the 10th Conference of the Parties of the CBD last year in Japan. So they're going public with this. And they're pretty clear about what they need to do about it, looking not just at direct impacts, but also their indirect impacts. And I was struck by a contrast between how sophisticated they are with respect to reducing materials use, reducing weight, using more environmentally friendly materials, recycling, and so on. There are a lot of things that they do with respect to their own operations that are fully integrated into their products. And yet when you look, and I should be happy with this, especially because they're making a contribution to my new employer, so it's always good news. When I look, on the other hand, at their biodiversity impacts, or their biodiversity actions, they're much less well connected to their operations. And I think this is typical of a lot of companies. They can see clearly how they need to address their energy use, or their materials consumption in their manufacturing, or increased recycling of waste materials. But they're often at a little bit of a loss about what to do on the biodiversity front. Just as they have trouble measuring their impacts on biodiversity and finding appropriate indicators, many companies struggle to find appropriate investments or appropriate activities to support that relate to biodiversity and also relate to their own operations. And it tends to make their biodiversity actions look more like charitable, disconnected activities compared to some of their other environmental actions. It's not to discount the value of those investments, but it suggests to me that many companies, particularly manufacturing companies that are a bit remote from direct footprints on ecosystems, sometimes find it difficult to identify appropriate actions that they can take. And as a result, you see a lot of tree planting around manufacturing facilities, or you see contributions to conservation organizations, NGOs, in completely different parts of the world that have no link whatsoever with their production activities. So those are just some ideas and one example of what companies can do on a voluntary basis, and some of the constraints that they face in addressing biodiversity footprint in particular. I should probably go back to one other example. Unilever, a few months ago, came out with a sustainable living plan, and their approach to this is really to focus on raw material supply and on certification of the sustainability of those raw materials. I think it's easier here for an agricultural processing and food processing company to identify the links with biodiversity, because things like grains and fiber and dairy are so central to their activities, and fish, for example. Again, very heroic goals. Are they going to actually be able to find enough sustainably produced material to meet 100% of their needs by 2020? It's not obvious. And there's real difficulties in providing enough of the certified timber, for example, to meet the potential demand. And many people in the trade will say, well, we'd love to buy the stuff, it's just not available, so we buy the regular. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about more the regulatory side and what business can do in terms of helping to develop market-friendly environmental policies. That is to say, policies that support biodiversity conservation, but that also help reduce costs or increase profits. And another way to put that is to try and identify what kind of regulatory reforms are most efficient or effective in stimulating business action. And I think it's useful here to step back and remind ourselves of what's the context for this, and what has been the history of environmental policy, particularly with respect to biodiversity and ecosystems. And it's quite complex, but I think it's fair to say that an awful lot of that existing policy framework is focused on doing no harm, reducing harm, or trying to minimize habitat disturbance and conversion, trying to ensure that resource management is more sustainable, reducing pollution, trying to ensure that benefits are shared equitably, not just genetic resources but other resources, and trying to raise more money. And these are the kind of things that we've been hearing from the environmental community for years and years. And they're not necessarily directly relevant or translatable to the business world, and that's been a bit of a problem. And we've seen in particular a huge emphasis on a kind of command and control, or an effort to constrain resource use as a way of protecting biodiversity. And so the most conventional or classic approach is more protected areas. And we've seen a huge growth in protected areas around the world. And despite that, last year again, we saw a call for more protected areas. And this is fine, and they do play a role in biodiversity conservation, but we also know that they're hugely difficult to finance. And that's partly because they rely very heavily on public funding for the most part. And essentially they're taking resources out of productive use, or out of market use, but without any clear mechanism to generate funding for that other than tax revenue. And protected areas have other problems, as we know. They impose, as we saw last time, large opportunity costs on local populations. And this is a case that was carried out by a colleague of mine in Uganda, looking at the impacts of protected areas on local resource uses and the loss of economic production opportunities to local communities as a result of the creation of the protected area. Loss of pasture, wildlife damage to farms because you have more wildlife if you have a protected area, and other restrictions on resource use. And on the other side of the ledger, there's not enough revenue coming in, whether it's from tourism or from the state, to make up that gap. And I think partly in response to frustration with the traditional approaches, whether those are protected areas or technology constraints, for example, the limits on the kind of nets you can use for fishing or when you can go fishing. These are all useful instruments, but they often are working against the tide of economic pressure, and they're not working with the grain of economic incentives. And so a different approach that people have been trying to develop in the last, I guess, 10 or 20 years is to mobilize economic incentives, to make it more profitable to do the right thing, less profitable to do the wrong thing. And that starts very often with trying to unpick subsidies that are driving unsustainable resource use. And we've seen any number of official documents and unofficial documents that talk about how we can generate more resources for biodiversity conservation by using intelligent, market-based or market-oriented economic incentives. And TEEB likewise talks quite a lot, not just about what are ecosystem values and how do we quantify and measure those, but also how do we capture those values? How do we realize them and make them real in monetary terms to consumers and producers? And just to liven things up a little bit, I wanted to get a sense from people in the room as what's your take on that? Because I realize that it's controversial and that there are many people, particularly in the environmental community, who are uncomfortable with this approach to using economic incentives. They're uncomfortable with putting a price on natural resources. We've seen this, for example, in the Global Water Forum, year after year. The idea of putting a price on water is considered anathema to many people. So I'm curious to know in this room, given that sometimes people think that certain aspects of nature are priceless or should be priceless, I'd like people here to volunteer, give me their view on under what conditions, if ever, should nature have a price. And I'm hoping that somebody will take a crack at that. I should probably move on a little bit and continue. I appreciate the different perspectives on pricing nature and commodification of nature, and I think you've put your finger on a lot of the concerns that people have, and you've also made it reinforced in my mind the fact that this is not a resolved issue, that there's still the boundaries of what's appropriate and under what conditions still need to be discussed and figured out. Having said that, the big global institutions and most of the scientific community continue to push this line. And you see it again and again in some of the seminal reports, such as the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, came out in 2005, talking about not just valuation, but integrating those values into economic decision-making, reforming subsidies, paying for ecosystem services, reducing unsustainable consumption, and using a variety of economic instruments to try and promote more conservation and restoration. And it might be helpful to think a little bit about what does that mean in practice? What are we actually talking about? If you boil it down, essentially we're comparing different practices, different types of production, different types of consumption. Some are more damaging than others. And very simply, what we want to do is to increase the costs of the unsustainable practice and decrease the costs of the more sustainable models. And on the flip side, we want to reduce the benefits of the unsustainable practice and increase the economic benefits of the more sustainable choice. And there are a range of different mechanisms that we can use in those 4 different boxes to try and achieve those increases or decreases in costs and benefits. You're probably familiar with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment and its categorization of different ecosystem services and the way they grouped them into enhanced, degraded, and mixed, and the point that they made in that report that the only ecosystem services that were enhanced, as far as they could tell, were the ones related mainly to commodity production for human needs, as well as carbon sequestration. And I think that was mainly because of forest growth in the temperate regions. But that most other ecosystem services they identified were in decline. And last time we talked a little bit about payments for ecosystem services, which I sometimes like to describe as fixing markets. You have an existing commodity, it's traded widely, whether it's an agricultural commodity, commercial fish, timber, or pulp. But those markets are not reflecting all of the ecosystem service values, all the environmental values associated with the production of those goods. And so we have a range of instruments for fixing markets. And we talked a little bit about that last time, in particular the concept of defining sustainability standards, turning those into a certification and labeling scheme, ensuring the third-party verification of producers' adherence to those standards. But what I want to talk a little bit more about now is creating markets. So not just what do you do about the things that are already traded and where we can improve practices, but what do you do when you have an ecosystem service that essentially is completely invisible from a market perspective? And until recently, that was the case with carbon, of course. It's still the case largely with genetic material, although there's some few trades that we can see around bioprospecting. In most countries, it's still true with respect to water quality, and in some cases, just raw water quantity. And I've added, as you can see, habitat restoration down at the bottom, because that, again, is a fairly recent case, except in the US, where there's been some progress in a few other countries. Carbon is the best known of these, and probably the largest market to have emerged just in the last few years. And it's striking how quickly that took off, mainly because of action by European governments. So they established the emissions trading scheme, entered into force, I think, in 2005. And within a few years after that, you had transactions in the order of 100 billion US dollars. Alongside that, we had the Clean Development Mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol, much smaller, but still generating some significant financial flows. And if you add that up over those few years, you're looking at over $300 billion that wasn't going into anything like this before, and was now going into energy conservation, emission reductions, forest carbon offsets, and a range of other activities, of which almost $80 billion was from Annex 1 countries, that is to say developed countries, to the developing countries that were offering climate mitigation credits. Now, there are all kinds of problems with this market, as we know. It has been extremely volatile. The Europeans didn't always get the allocation of quotas right, and so prices went all over the place, and speculators, some of them got burned. We don't really care about the speculators, but we do care perhaps about the environmental effectiveness of the scheme, and if you don't have some certainty about the value of your quota, you can easily understand that businesses are not going to invest in them. There have also been concerns about the allocation of clean development finance. The clean development mechanism is sometimes called the China development mechanism because so much of that money went into China for, particularly for the destruction of certain industrial gases. And there have been concerns about the types of projects that have been used to generate carbon credits, and in particular the very low amount of funding that went into forestry and agriculture and related sort of ecosystem-friendly mitigation activities. On the voluntary side, there's been perhaps more success at generating resources for forest restoration, forest conservation. It's a completely different scale, of course. I mean, here you've got a table for the showing the investments in forest carbon in particular. And you remember from the previous slide, it was about 1% of the CDM total. And that corresponds to the 6 million in 2010 in this table. But in contrast, we have rather more substantial resources, as I said, in the voluntary market. These are people who do not have a legal requirement to mitigate their greenhouse gas emissions or to achieve any climate change targets, but they, for whatever reason, have decided that they wish to do so and are prepared to pay for that. And a lot of this, in fact, is red money. Just within the last couple of years, there's been growing interest in financing red projects. But a more conventional type of forest carbon project, and you've probably studied this, is this example from Tanzania, where investors find some degraded land, usually previously cultivated agricultural land. They acquire a lease and plant, in this case, as in many other cases, exotic species that grow fast and can lock up a lot of carbon quite quickly. And they manage to push it through the very arduous permitting system that is the Clean Development Mechanism or the voluntary carbon standard in order to get credits. And very often they supplement the value of those carbon credits, as you know, with other co-benefits, such as in this case, telephone poles, furniture, pallets for shipping, and so on. And one of the main concerns in Tanzania, as in many other countries, has been the social impacts of these forest carbon projects. And the idea that by bringing in foreign investment, you may be essentially having the same effect as a conventional protected area. You're putting a fence around a place, armed guards, keeping people out. They're losing access to resources that they previously enjoyed for the benefit of polluters in the north. And I think in this respect, a lot of these environmental markets are not so different from conventional markets, in the sense that you have different interest groups looking for different outcomes. So this is a case study from Indonesia that compared the perspective of local communities, logging industries, local government, national government, and the international community with respect to 3 different land use options. And the authors discovered in this case that while it might make more sense in economic terms, in net present value terms, to go with the conservation option, and that was certainly the perspective from the local communities, from the perspective of the logging industry, it was much better to cut the trees down. No surprise. This is just confirming sort of the intuition that we would have. And I think you can draw an analogy with the carbon market, or indeed with some other ecosystem service markets. There might be cases where, for the local community, the best option is the status quo, which includes some unsustainable resource use. And you could substitute the conservation banking industry or the carbon investment industry for the logging industry. Very often, their interests are not going to be aligned. And we have some work to do to try and find ways to align those interests better. And that leads me to Wall Street, because I thought my last lecture here, I was intrigued by this phenomena and went down to visit Liberty Park or Zuccotti Park, whatever you want to call it, over the weekend. And I was struck by the emphasis there on the equity issues, but no consideration, no discussion that I could see, or very little, of the environmental issues. And I'm wondering if there are people here who have thoughts on how do these things relate to each other, right? Is there some... Occupy Wall Street's very concerned, very focused on inequity in American society, in capitalism generally, about the rich not pulling their weight, not paying their fair share of taxes. And I'm wondering if there are any opinions or views here on what does this have to do with biodiversity. If you were to go yourself to New York or to the Occupy Wall Street events here in New Haven, for that matter, what would you say about biodiversity and ecosystems? What does it have to do with that? There's good research, for example, on the effect of inequality on health outcomes in many countries. There's pretty good research on the effect of inequality on productivity, growth, and in some countries. And there are a few studies that look at the relation between inequality and biodiversity loss, but I think they're a little bit tenuous. I haven't seen the particular paper you're referring to, but it's not a well-researched area. It's not like, I mean, it would be nice to be able to write on a T-shirt, "Inequality destroys the earth," but we don't really know that, and I think maybe that's something that could be of interest as a research agenda, people who want to pursue this. Try and understand what are the links between inequality and natural resource use. Does it make it easier or harder to find solutions, or does it exacerbate the problem in some way? And can we measure that? It's not so straightforward. This example that I referred to earlier is suggestive, but it simply is pointing out the fact that incentives are different among different groups. It's not saying that if there was somehow more equality in Indonesia, there would be, more conservation. That's a hypothesis one might draw out of the study, but it's not a proof of that. Anyways, it's an interesting question to think about. Coming back to carbon markets, and I flag them because they are, as I said, one of the biggest, most well-integrated global environmental markets created within the last few years. I think we can identify a number of lessons that come out of that for any kind of market creation for ecosystem services. One we've talked a lot about is the issue of currency. What is it you're trading? How do you measure that? Secondly, once you've defined what it is you're going to trade, what is the ecosystem service that you're pricing and transferring, what are the approved methodologies or recognized means of delivering that output, that product? If you're turning an ecosystem service into a tradable commodity, you need some way for people to say, yes, that is a legitimate way to produce that commodity. And in the carbon market, there's certain things you can do that are recognized as delivering a carbon credit, and many other things that people would like to do that they think would generate a carbon credit, but they're not yet approved. And you have to go through a review process to get your methodology approved, as we discovered with the mangrove restoration project with Dannon. And that takes quite some time, costs quite a lot of money to develop a methodology that crosses all the T's and dots all the I's and gets the approval of the United Nations. And you also need, alongside those methodologies, performance standards to assess whether people are actually following the methodology in the approved manner and delivering, as one hopes, the desired ecosystem service. And I think there's a lot of focus on methodologies and performance standards because very often we can't see or feel or touch the ecosystem service. So you don't really know for sure how many tons of carbon have been pulled out of the atmosphere. All you know is that somebody has planted a bunch of trees. And so you have to say, well, did they plant the approved species in the approved planting pattern following the approved methodologies? If so, we can by inference assume that that carbon was in fact locked up in those trees in the quantities that they claim. And I think the same is true for many watershed protection schemes, that we can't measure directly the watershed benefits. Sometimes you can measure changes in water quality and quantity, but often that's expensive and you can't do it on a regular basis. So what you measure instead is the change in land use. Realistic targets and caps and timetables is a critical issue here. We've seen the failure in the carbon market of people to negotiate realistic targets and timetables. And that can upset the market because it will discourage investors from getting involved. It creates extra volatility in pricing, and that scares people off. There's a variety of instruments that can stimulate private investment. It's not just one. In the carbon market, we've seen incentives for energy efficiency. We've seen technology standards to try and promote less energy-intensive goods and services. We've seen tax credits. We've seen the trading scheme itself. So it's not always just one mechanism that is going to deliver what we want, but there may be many related market mechanisms, and they're not always consistent with each other. Monitoring and enforcement is a key issue. You may have heard about a year ago, I think, some people stole a bunch of carbon credits from an account in Europe and resold them in another country. And that was because there wasn't really a very tight control on the accounting of those carbon credits. If you're going to be trading an intangible good or ecosystem service, you need to have very tight control over the registries that keep track of trades, what's being traded, make sure it isn't traded again and again. And particularly with respect to social impacts, we need to have an adaptive approach because we don't always anticipate the unintended consequences on certain communities of the actions we take, and we need to somehow make adjustments. And you can see this very clearly in the case of the Mexican PES scheme, where when people see how the system is set up, they start to try and manipulate it to their maximum advantage, and therefore the government changes the system and adapts it year on year to try and improve it to get the outcomes that they want in terms, environmental terms and in social terms. You can't just have one system and assume that it's going to continue working forever in the same way. People will start playing with it as soon as it's alive. Notwithstanding all those caveats and challenges of payments for ecosystem services, we've seen more and more countries set them up, and these are largely government-funded schemes. And contrary to what some people have said in recent years, that, oh, this is just for rich countries, in fact, many developing countries are putting quite substantial sums of money into payments for ecosystem service schemes, including in China, something like $4 billion a year going into the sloping land conversion program, which is essentially an incentive scheme to try and reduce deforestation on steeply sloped land, reduce erosion, runoff, siltation, and sedimentation downstream. And at the other end of the scale, you have some very small programs in countries like Bulgaria and Romania, in Ecuador. And I think it's important to recognize that you don't need to have a huge program. You don't need to be a government with tremendous capacity. Things can be done locally at a relatively small scale that are effective. I talked last time about biodiversity offsets, and I just wanted to make a few comments on the evolution of that and the emergence of these trading schemes for habitat or for ecosystems. I'm aware that there are people in the room who know more about this than I do, but a lot of people have been looking recently from outside the US at the experience in this country with wetland mitigation banking. It's become a kind of test case or pilot project A lot of European governments in particular see it as an example of what they could be doing themselves, and not necessarily exactly the same. So for those who don't know, this is a program that was authorized back in the 70s under the Clean Water Act, but didn't really get going until the end of the 1980s, and didn't attract major investment, private investment, until the 90s, I believe. But essentially the idea is that if you impact a wetland as determined by the federal government, what is a wetland, in the United States, you have to compensate for that impact. And in general, that compensation has to be in kind. That is to say, you need to restore or conserve wetland, equivalent wetland, typically more area than what you have impacted, and generally within the same watershed, or so what they call service area, as the impact. And because you can do it yourself, but you can also contract a third party to do it, we've seen over the last 20 years or so the emergence of a very lively trade in wetland mitigation credits from entrepreneurs, mostly private entrepreneurs, who have acquired land, restored wetlands on that land, obtained credits from the government, and turned around and sold those to developers. It's worth pointing out that a lot of the purchasing has been by government agencies, particularly the transport companies, transport agencies in the States. When they're building new roads, widening them, for example, they might have an impact on wetlands, and they need to compensate for that under the same legislation. The value of this market is really hard to tell because it's an incredibly untransparent market. My sense is that if you want to get information on the price of particular trades, the price of credits, it's not something you can look up on Bloomberg, right? And maybe that's an indication that it's still a relatively immature market, in that it's not a very transparent market. Nevertheless, people have tried to gather information on this market, and also on similar initiatives in other countries. So you can see the little dots on the map. I can't remember what the distinction is between the white dots and the dark dots, but essentially they refer to different versions of biodiversity offsets and habitat trading. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the habitat trading ones are the darker dots. That is to say, those are countries in which governments have either set up or are in the process of setting up trading schemes rather than just one-off offset schemes. And as you can see, there's a concentration of experience in North America, Europe, and Australia. And I'm looking forward to learning about the Australian experience when I get there very soon. Okay, I've sort of reached the end of the material that's in the TEEB for Business report and what I've prepared for these lectures. And I just wanted to very quickly recap what we've covered and some conclusions from that, if I may. Firstly, we looked a little bit at what's the business case? Why would businesses be interested in biodiversity and ecosystem services? We've looked at how companies can understand the magnitude of their impacts, positive and negative, or their dependence on ecosystem services. We looked at a range of tools that businesses have developed on their own or in partnership with others to try and avoid or mitigate biodiversity risks. And we've looked at some of the emerging business opportunities, the positive or good news where there's an alignment between business value and environmental value. We've looked at some of the target setting and other voluntary actions that businesses can take, and I should supplement that by pointing out that more and more businesses are interested in getting involved in discussions about regulatory reform, and they're particularly interested in these market-based approaches because they can see how that might be aligned better with their own investment strategies. And we've looked a little bit at some of the different types of regulatory reforms that are in place or are being put in place. And I just want to conclude with a couple of thoughts on aligning market incentives with biodiversity conservation. And the first is, I suppose, the obvious, that markets do not deal very well with intangible or non-market values. So you somehow need to find a way to make the intangible, the aesthetic, the spiritual, the cultural, if you're willing to, into something more tangible. And while we don't always know what the boundaries are of what's appropriate to bring into the market, what's appropriate to commodify, if you don't do that, the market will continue to ignore it for the most part. And you can try and build a fence around it, but then you have enforcement issues. And we can see that in many cases, the power of the market overwhelms the capacity of governments to enforce constraints on resource use. I think we've also seen from experience that while voluntary market initiatives can work relatively well, they're not always sufficient. So you can attract a certain level of business commitment through certification schemes, through voluntary carbon markets and what have you, voluntary biodiversity offsets. But if you really want to get scale, and I think the Europeans proved this with the emissions trading scheme, if you want to get significant scale of investment in these ecosystem markets, you need a regulatory, mandatory scheme. You need relatively powerful market incentives, not just wishful thinking. And those incentives, they can be designed in such a way as to attract private investment. They can be business friendly. They can be market oriented, and they include information instruments such as certification and labeling, but also reporting and disclosure requirements. They include fiscal policy reforms, undoing so-called perverse subsidies, such as subsidies for land conversion in some countries, or subsidies to the oil and gas industry. But you can also use carrots, tax credits, or other payments for ecosystem services to try and encourage people to do the right thing. And a particularly powerful mechanism for creating incentives for the private sector is reform of property rights and liability. And I include the two together. Markets are predicated on private property rights. They're predicated on the notion that you can exclude people from certain resources, you control those, and you can use those in certain ways. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an expert in tenure and liability by any means, but I think it's clear that if we're going to make progress on environmental markets, we need much more collaboration with the law community on the design or redesign of resource tenure and environmental liability schemes. And I also want to leave you with some conclusions on the poverty angle, because I think it's hard to have a discussion about ecosystem markets anywhere in the world today without also getting into a discussion about poverty, development, equity, and distribution. And I think they do go together, even though we don't always have the analytical tools or the evidence base to really understand what are those interactions. But I think we can draw some conclusions from experience to date, and that is that if you want to have a positive impact on the poorer communities and more vulnerable societies, you need to focus your business action on the places where they live, the sectors in which poorer groups work, such as agriculture, forestry, fisheries, the factors of production that they own. That's basically their own labor, to some extent land, the outputs that they can produce, which again are often commodities, the markets that they can participate in, and the costs that they can afford. And I think similarly, when we look at what strategies are going to achieve more pro-poor outcomes in terms of interventions, whether it's by development agencies or by businesses, first and foremost it's governance and the rule of law. And there's limits to what business can do there, but I think without that rule of law, we're not going to get equitable outcomes, let alone environmentally effective outcomes. Access to information and services, reducing constraints is often an effective mechanism. And we've seen this in many developing countries where if you want, for example, to get involved in charcoal production or in sustainable wood production or in sustainable agriculture, there are all kinds of regulations that make it difficult for people to do that. Bigger companies can afford to get through those regulatory schemes. Poorer producers, small-scale producers find it very difficult. So We've seen in carbon markets, for example, the development of so-called small-scale or small-scale methodologies to try and get around this constraint on the regulatory constraint on participation of the poor. Participation is a sort of a mantra in the environmental movement. We always need to try and improve the extent to which marginalized groups can take part in decision making. A big part of that is looking at not just global priorities but also local environmental concerns, which may be more to do with clean water, water supply, access to agricultural land, rather than some of these global concerns that we have about biodiversity or climate. And promoting sustainable use rather than simply strict conservation can be a useful strategy as well. That's a lot to try and boil down into a couple of slides, and thank you for bearing with me on that. I've reached the end of my contribution to this course. I want to leave you with a list of the people who should have been up here with me and might have been even more eloquent than I, but these are the people who contributed to the TEEB for Business report, among the many other hundreds of people who contributed to other TEEB reports, and I think they also deserve a round of applause. So thank you very much. It's been a privilege and a pleasure.